such an honor to be with you tonight and to share this stage with such incredible women who have come before me, right? It's been an amazing event. I'm really happy to be able to talk with you tonight about something that I'm really passionate about, and that's the power of education to change a girl's life. My passion for education began when I was just starting my career in international development as a young, naive Peace Corps volunteer, teaching English in a rural village in northern Namibia. One of my students' name was also Rachel. We hit it off immediately because we were namesakes, and I noticed something right off the bat about Rachel. She looked quite a bit older than an 8th grade girl. She looked more like a young woman. But Rachel was a hard worker, dedicated, excellent student, and very soft-spoken but kind. So one afternoon, when she invited me to come back to her village, see her home, and meet her family, I jumped on the opportunity, welcomed that opportunity of hospitality as a foreigner and a new person in town. So I packed up my things and I began to follow her down towards town. But I was a bit surprised when she continued past town and kept leading me down to the Kavango River, and we eventually approached the checkpoint there. There was a checkpoint at the Kavango River because the river marked the border between Namibia and Angola. So as we approached the checkpoint, I said, "Rachel, where in the world are you taking me?" And she pointed across the river to a small village on the other side, on the Angolan side. So I realized then, as I filled out the paperwork and showed my ID, that Rachel must live in Angola. So I followed her, and we boarded a small hand-carved wooden canoe, and we made our way across the river. She brought me to her family, we met, I saw the village, and we enjoyed a cold Coke together. It wasn't until a little while later that I realized the reason that Rachel made this journey 5 days a week, 2 times to be able to go to school. And that had a lot to do with the Angolan Civil War that went on from 1975 to 2002 and killed over 800,000 people. To this day, in rural areas of Angola, there still remains landmines that have not been successfully demined, and it's unsafe to travel. So in Rachel's rural village, there wasn't a school. So for her to be able to fight for her right to education, she got on a canoe every day, went to a checkpoint, crossed that international border to be able to go to school. But her story doesn't stop there. I started to notice something else about Rachel, and that was she was frequently absent. I began to notice a pattern. It was about every month, she would be absent 3, 4, sometimes 5 days a week. And she wasn't alone. Many of the other girls in my class also had these frequent absences. So for all the women in the room, you're probably putting 2 and 2 together. It was because of her menstrual cycle. My school had very limited facilities. We only had a pit latrine for a bathroom. And many girls found it unsafe and unsanitary to use during their period. Many of them also lacked proper menstrual supplies. So I was indeed correct. Rachel was quite a bit older than an 8th grader. She should have been in the 11th grade, the year that I taught her, and she failed the 8th grade 3 times because of significant absences every year. So hearing Rachel's story, beginning to understand this and see it unfold, filled me with anger, sadness, and then eventually guilt. I was confronted with the considerable privilege of the literally limitless access to education that I had. I graduated high school, went on to a private university, and then after that went on to earn 3 master's degrees. Not only did I gain in unlimitless education and knowledge because of that, but it opened opportunities and career paths for me. So I was fueled by Rachel's dedication, thinking about all that she did to continue fighting for her education. And so I knew that I had to act. And the first thing I did was do everything in my power to make sure that Rachel graduated the 8th grade that year. And then I began to eventually turn that guilt into a conviction and a passion to continue working in this sector that I've been working in for about 12 to 15 years now, which is education and emergencies. I'm really happy now to be working stateside for the International Rescue Committee in Washington, where I continue to work in education and emergencies, but advocating for newcomer women and girls who are arriving here in Washington to have equitable access to education. The longer I've been in this work, the more and more that I've realized that education is so important beyond just book knowledge and academics. I'm a firm believer now that education is power, because through education, we gain the agency to choose our future. For those of us who have experienced crisis and trauma, education gives us the ability to regain control of our lives and direct our future paths. Education unlocks the ability to challenge social norms and belief systems by experiencing different perspectives. And education unleashes our imagination, our creativity that allow us to dream and hope. But the tragic reality is that for youth and children that live in crisis and conflict-affected areas, their access to education is often very limited. So I want to share with you a few statistics just to paint this picture and give you an idea of the context. This first stat shows you the global average enrollment rate in primary school versus the average enrollment rate for those students that come from a refugee background. If we move on to secondary school, you can see that the gap widens quite a bit more, significantly, with those that come from a refugee background only accessing secondary school at the rate of 24%. Finally, when we look at higher education, it's even more stark, with those that come from a refugee background, only about 3% of them enrolling in higher education. But the sad statistics don't stop there. Women and girls are 2.5 times more likely to be out of school if they come from a crisis and conflict-affected area, and 90% more likely to be out of secondary school. I would be remiss if I didn't pause here and acknowledge the horrific and tragic things that are happening in Afghanistan under Taliban rule. Currently, there are no women and girls allowed to attend school past the 6th grade in Afghanistan. This is an extreme example of how crisis and conflict disproportionately impact women and girls, take away their right to education, their power, and their future. Now, sadly, I have to tell you I need to shift to another crisis, and that's the Ukrainian crisis. This is impacting us both globally and locally. Since February, there's been 5 million individuals that have fled Ukraine. Men are currently mostly banned from leaving the country. So the majority of that 5 million are women and children who are fleeing alone. Like Victoria, who fled with her child and 2 friends. And she had this to say: I made the unimaginable decision to leave Ukraine for the safety of my child. I left everyone, my husband, my siblings, my parents, my entire family in the Ukraine. Now that I'm here, I use my voice to speak up for the people back home. Ukraine is a peaceful country. For a long time, it was full of peaceful people who never wanted any war. We simply want to live. So IRC is on the ground with our partners in Ukraine, Poland, Moldova, and Romania, and we're providing emergency humanitarian assistance. But we're also working locally here in Washington, because we're already starting to see Ukrainians come in to Washington State, and we're expecting the number to increase quite significantly in the next 3 to 6 months. Washington is a very welcoming state, so we typically always receive large numbers, but also particularly in the Ukraine crisis, we're expecting more because we already have a large Ukrainian population here in Washington. So IRC is preparing to be able to serve the women and children that will be arriving here and already are, with temporary housing, immigration assistance, mental health supports, and critical education programs. I say critical education programs because unfortunately, the barriers to girls' and women's education don't stop once they come to the US. When they arrive here, they may have better access to education, but many of them are arriving with interrupted schooling. Many of them will be missing 2 months to 2 to 3 years of schooling. So they're entering our school system already behind. They're faced with language and culture shock. They're trying to navigate new systems that can sometimes be inequitable, all the while recovering from trauma. So the IRC youth and education programs that I have the privilege of leading, we provide services and we work with 6 different school districts, amazing partners, to make sure that newcomers who are arriving in our school system are welcomed in an inclusive, safe environment, that mothers have the ability to connect well to school, speak to their child's teacher, and advocate for their kids' education. And we provide academic support so that students can transition well, build their literacy skills, fill in gaps in their education, all within a safe and healing learning environment while they regain control of their lives and their future. Like Rose Rose was a high school student last year working with her IRC mentor, and they realized that she was failing 2 classes and she wasn't going to graduate. They realized this in April. So Rose and her IRC mentor began looking over her grades and her assignments to figure out why she was failing these 2 classes. And her IRC mentor began to coach her on how to go and have a conversation with these 2 teachers. They talked about how to approach it, what exactly to say, and they even rehearsed these conversations a few times. Rose built her confidence and went and approached those 2 teachers who were, of course, thrilled at her proactivity and helped her find a way to be able to pass those classes. Rose was a proud 2021 high school graduate last year and is now studying to be a nurse. Yeah. So you can support newcomer mothers and girls that are coming into Washington State first by building awareness in your community about the disproportionate way that crisis and conflict affects women and girls and their right to education, and building awareness of all the newcomers that we are welcoming here in Washington State. 2, welcome them into your neighborhoods, into your schools, into your churches, into your grocery stores. Make it a welcoming place for them. You can become a volunteer tutor or mentor with IRC next academic year. We would love to have you, and there's information downstairs about how to sign up. But finally, I want to invite you to partner with us with our Rebuilding Lives campaign. Rebuilding Lives campaign will specifically support newcomers that are arriving here in Washington State right now. It helps us fill in critical gaps in funding to make sure we can provide urgent services where they're needed most, like emergency assistance, temporary housing, mental health supports and case management, and the critical education programs like I mentioned. So thinking about Rachel, who crossed into a different country to be able to go to school, I'm reminded of the strength and resilience of women and girls. I'd like you to stand now if you have a high school diploma, college education, or a graduate degree. Please stand with me. For a girl who survived crisis and conflict, education is healing, and education is power to change her life. The collective power that all of us hold in this room because of our education could open doors for thousands of girls that come behind us. So I hope you'll join me today using your power to make sure that girls who are arriving here in Washington are welcomed and have access to the same power that you and I have had to change their lives, open their futures, and become bold, powerful women in our community. Thank you so much.